Welcome to the quaint Yorkshire village of Haworth, famed as the home of the literary Brontë sisters, and renowned for its eye-catching landscape of gorgeous winding lanes and spectacular countryside views. On this tour of the village centre on a quiet morning, we'll explore the story of how the Brontë sisters came to live in Haworth, as well as the history of the village itself, from its early years to its modern-day role as one of Yorkshire's most picturesque and popular destinations. But we begin at the top of Main Street in the centre of Haworth, which is set up on top of a rather windy hill. We'll take a walk down the steep cobbles of Main Street in a short while, but at the top here, we find ourselves on a crossroads where you can see two of Haworth's many historic pubs. There's the Old White Lion, which was built in the 18th century, and just next door here, the King's Arms, which dates to the 17th century. The majority of the quaint buildings you'll find in the heart of Haworth today date from roughly that period, but the King's Arms stands on the beautiful, narrow and winding Church Lane here, which of course takes its name from one of the most important buildings in Haworth. This is the Church of St Michael and All Angels, which was built from 1879 to 1881, and which was actually the third church building to have stood on this site. Originally, the first chapel on this spot was built all the way back in the 14th century, before making way for a slightly larger church building with a tower in 1488. This Victorian-era church, meanwhile, has an even taller tower, and it was built during a period when it, and the village of Haworth as a whole, were becoming popular visitor destinations. That surge in popularity was of course because of the legacy of Haworth's most famous family, the Brontës, who moved to the village in 1820. The blue plaque adorning this building tells us that this was the old schoolroom, built by Patrick Brontë, the father figure of the family, who also worked as the minister at the church behind us. Church Lane here was a centre of life for the Brontë siblings, Anne, Charlotte, Emily and Branwell, who were educated inside this building during their younger years. The schoolroom was built in 1832, and even as the siblings grew up, the building remained a part of their lives, even hosting Charlotte Brontë's wedding reception in 1854, when she was 37 years old. From a young age right up to adulthood, this part of Haworth was always home for the Brontë siblings, with the family house located here at the top of Church Lane, just a few steps away from the school and church with which they were closely associated. As you'd expect, the Brontë old house is a popular tourist attraction today, and is now operated as the Brontë Parsonage Museum. But the house dates from a time even before the Brontës moved to Haworth, originally built in the 1770s as a home for the minister of the neighbouring church. With the arrival of the Brontës in 1820, however, the house became a focal point for the village, as the family's father figure, Patrick Brontë, was a major agent of change in Haworth at the time. But as we make our way away from the family's old house, who exactly were the Brontës, and how did they come to live in the beautiful little village of Haworth? Well, the family is best known for the legacy of the three Brontë sisters, Anne, Charlotte and Emily, a trio of England's most celebrated writers. The sisters were all originally born in the nearby village of Thornton, located just on the outskirts of the city of Bradford. Looking at a map of the local area, we can see Haworth's proximity to Bradford and Thornton, the sisters' original birthplace, and where they lived until 1820 as a rather large family of 8. At the head of the family was Patrick Brontë and his wife, Maria Brontë, maiden name Branwell, who had married back in 1812. However, Maria sadly passed away just a year after the family moved here to Haworth, and so to help to care for the young family in their new home, Maria's older sister, Elizabeth Branwell, moved to live with the Brontës in Haworth. Known to the children as Aunt Branwell, Elizabeth taught the Brontë children everything in their younger years. Now, at the time when they moved to Haworth, there were 6 Brontë siblings, but in 1825, tragedy struck the family, as the 2 eldest, Maria and Elizabeth, died at the ages of just 11 and 10 after an outbreak of typhoid at the Cowan Bridge School, located quite a distance away in the neighbouring county of Lancashire, and to where all of the children were initially set to be sent for schooling. However, in the aftermath of the death of his wife and his 2 eldest daughters, Patrick Brontë pulled his remaining 4 children out of Cowan Bridge, and began building the schoolroom that we saw earlier in order to keep his family close by as they grew up. Patrick's 4 youngest children, Anne, Charlotte, Emily and Branwell, would then go on to spend most of their childhood here in Haworth, during which time the girls developed their skills and love for writing, while Branwell, the only boy of the 4, gained a love for art and architecture, and he earned money as a portrait painter later on in life. Breaking off briefly from the story of the Brontë family, here on the northern edge of Haworth village centre, we're passing by the West Lane Baptist Church, built back in 1752. The Baptist Church is one of 5 churches located in this village of just over 6,000 people, which is home to a number of different religious denominations. From here, we'll now walk along North Street, before we head back into the higgledy-piggledy heart of Haworth to explore more of the village. But here on the northern side of the village, we're passing by rows of houses that are occupied both by locals, and some of which are open as cottages for tourists to stay in when visiting the village. Of course, with its links to the Brontës, Haworth has become a hugely popular tourist destination, and almost a place of pilgrimage for literary fans that travel here from all over the world. The 3 Brontë sisters, depicted in this painting of 1834 by their brother Branwell, are world famous for their literary works, with their upbringing in Haworth and the surrounding region having inspired some of their most acclaimed stories. As we pass by the Brontë weaving shed, a historic place for local weavers since named after the family, let's take a look at some of the most famous works by the 3 Brontë sisters, many of which you'll almost certainly have heard of or even read yourself. One of the most enduring of their stories was Jane Eyre, written by Charlotte, the eldest of the 3 sisters, in 1847. Jane Eyre is of course one of British literature's greatest and most influential novels, having been adapted into various different media over the last 175 years. It was a groundbreaking novel that's noted for its intimate first-person narrative, but at the time it was published, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre wasn't actually particularly acclaimed, in fact criticised for its supposed immorality within the world of polite society. Similar controversy came for Charlotte's sister Emily, who in 1847, the same year, published her one and only novel, the famous Wuthering Heights. An instantly recognisable classic of 19th century literature, Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights was criticised at the time of its publication for its dark, savage drama that infuriated many critics of the day. The 3rd and youngest Brontë sister, Anne, was the writer of a number of novels, including Agnes Grey and The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, both published in the late 1840s. Now, while Anne's works are admittedly not as well known as her sister's 2 most famous novels, she has become increasingly renowned for penning what are today considered some of Britain's earliest feminist novels. Together, the 3 Brontë siblings' works remain iconic to this day, and although they had all moved away from Haworth at the time those works were published, their hometown here still retains its magical allure. That allure also extends beyond Haworth to the surrounding countryside, which is known as Brontë Country, home to a number of villages similar to Haworth, but each with their own unique heritage, such as nearby Oakworth, famous for appearing in the classic British film of 1970, The Railway Children. But as one of the country's easily most picturesque villages, Haworth too has been used as a filming location, particularly on the iconic Main Street, which we find ourselves at the top of once again. The view from the top of Main Street here, past the phone box and with the rolling hills in the background, is simply stunning, but the street is also full of fascinating locations on both sides. The Black Bull pub, for example, is one of the oldest alehouses in Haworth, with their tavern having stood here since at least the 16th century. Branwell Brontë was known to frequent the Black Bull in his adult years, often getting awfully drunk, much to the concern of his family. In fact, the Brontës would often check up on Branwell in the pub if they feared he was getting too drunk, although he would normally hot-foot it out of a back window and back home via the churchyard to escape. As well as serving as a watering hole for Branwell, the Black Bull was one of the many historic establishments that developed on Main Street as people would pass by, even before it was Brontë fans that were making their way to Haworth. The village that we see around us now is mostly a product of the 19th century, when the Brontës were around. But there was settlement here long before then, with the village first recorded all the way back in the year 1209. Haworth was likely an extremely small settlement before the modern period, suggested by a dissection of its name, which is thought to derive from the Old English referring to a hedge enclosure. But ever since then, the village has steadily grown in size, and as well as gaining notoriety for its association with the Brontës, Main Street here has also contributed nicely to Haworth's frozen-in-time image, having starred in numerous films and TV shows, like The Railway Children. Most strangely, however, Main Street was in 2014 part of the route of the Tour de France, which began that year in Leeds. Amazingly, the cyclists raced their way along these cobbles, going up what is a fantastically steep incline, but it certainly made for a stunning spectacle. Now, long before the advent of tourism and filming in Haworth, the village was a staunchly traditional community, at the heart of which was St Michael and All Angels Church, which we saw at the start of our walk. Before the parish church was built in the late 19th century, its predecessor was enlarged over a century beforehand in 1755. This was partly a result of the growth of Haworth's population, and therefore congregation, as local industry began to emerge. But this development wasn't entirely down to industrialisation, as Haworth locals in the 18th century peculiarly found themselves forcibly encouraged, for want of a better word, to attend church services. The Fleece Inn here is one of Haworth's newer pubs, built after a time when village drinkers were herded by a local preacher into the village church. The story goes that in 1742, a passionate evangelist by the name of William Grimshaw arrived in Haworth, which he saw as a dark village in need of spiritual enlightenment. To kickstart that campaign, Grimshaw is said to have regularly invaded the pubs of Haworth, and literally whipped the punters inside to make them attend his sermons. Now, despite the rather inhumane and frankly bizarre nature of Grimshaw's methods, they did actually prove quite effective. In fact, Grimshaw, who was known to give extremely long sermons, was eventually attracting huge crowds at Haworth's parish church, congregations so large that the church had to be enlarged to fit all the people attending inside. And even more strangely, Grimshaw's methods indirectly made Haworth the village it is today, as the enlarged parish church soon attracted Patrick Brontë, who became its minister in 1820, and after his arrival, the rest is history. Now at the bottom of Main Street, we find ourselves surrounded by many Victorian-era buildings, mostly constructed during the village's first boom period of the latter 19th century, which came on the back of local industrial development. But while industry was once the local focus, Haworth now counts on its quaint appearance to draw in tourists, who make up the central part of the village's economy today. Many people come to Haworth not only for its Brontë links, but also for its photogenic, Instagrammable streets and countryside vistas, with the top of Main Street and the streets around the Parsonage Museum often getting quite busy at the height of summer. But while many of the main sites in Haworth are located up at the top of the village, there's still a fair amount of sights to see down here, a number of which are detailed for you rather helpfully on this plaque of 1937. Behind the plaque, meanwhile, is the Old Hall Inn, one of the few pre-industrial era buildings to be found in Haworth, dating from 1580 during England's Tudor period. Nowadays, the Old Hall Inn has been converted into a pub, one of many in the village. Across the road, meanwhile, is another church, the second Baptist church we've seen on our walk, known as Hall Green Chapel, which was built in 1824. The chapel sits at the top of the steep Bridgehouse Lane, which takes you down from the village centre to the bottom of the hill on which Haworth is located. We'll make our way in that direction now, but rather than following the road, we're going to take a slightly more leisurely route through Central Park. Though by no means as mighty as the park of the same name over in New York City, Haworth Central Park is a lovely spot in the village, offering a delightful open space that's a stark contrast to the often cramped streets at the top of Main Street. The park was laid out in 1927, and it was originally intended to be a recreation ground complete with public baths and a large wash house. But a lack of funds for that project meant that the park was simply built for pleasure, complete with gorgeous gardens and flowers. A major undertaking in the village, the park was an impressive step forward for Haworth, which had historically been blighted by major infrastructure problems, particularly as the village's population began to grow rapidly in the 19th century. The rise in population outpaced the village's physical expansion, with Haworth going from a village of just a few hundred people in the late 18th century to a sizable village of over 3,000 by the mid-19th century, equating to almost half of its population today. But why exactly did this small, rural village see such dramatic growth in that period? The answer, like many towns and villages in Yorkshire's historic West Riding here, was textiles. At the beginning of the 19th century, a number of textile mills were constructed on the edge of Haworth, the largest of which was Ebor Mill, founded in 1819 on Bridgehouse Beck, a small tributary of the River Worth. A mill for the spinning of worsted wool, the Ebor Mill continued to expand throughout the 19th century as local industry boomed, and by 1851 it had come under the control of the Merrill brothers, who were already major local industrialists of the area. The Merrill brothers were developing a wool-spinning empire in and around this part of Yorkshire, encompassing mills on small waterways like the Ebor Mill in Haworth, and larger mills in towns like Keighley and Bingley on the River Aire. But before the Merrills arrived on the scene, Haworth was struggling to get off the ground in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. Around the time when the Brontës arrived in 1820, Haworth was a desperately poor village, with no sewage or sanitation systems in place. This contributed to widespread contamination of the local water sources, as waste and decomposing bodies, buried in the churchyard up at the top of the hill, would seep down through the soil. The health situation in Haworth was really quite severe, with villagers having an average life expectancy of just 25 years old, and almost half of all children dying under 6 months of age. Haworth was a tough place to live at that time, and while some villagers were working tough jobs in nearby quarries or out on the moors, unemployment was rife, and food was generally scarce here. Even the Brontës, although slightly better off, weren't immune to the trials of life in Haworth at the time. It's said that, later on in life, Charlotte Brontë had no teeth, which is thought to have been a result of vitamin deficiency that she gained during her time living in Haworth. Fortunately, as well as building the schoolroom for his children, Patrick Brontë was one of the first people to sponsor the construction of sustainable infrastructure to support the people of Haworth, and conditions in the village gradually began to improve, eventually evolving into the delightful place that we know today. Having walked all the way across Central Park, we're now nearly at the bottom of this hill, where we'll find the last landmark on our walk in Haworth, and what you might call the icing on the cake for this quintessentially quaint Yorkshire village, Haworth Railway Station. Now, Haworth Railway Station isn't your typical modern-day train stop, as it sits on the Keighley and Worth Valley Railway, a historic line that connected the town of Keighley to the north with Oxenhope just to the south of here. Haworth Station was opened all the way back in 1867 and operated until the line was closed in 1962. But the Keighley and Worth Valley Railway was soon reopened in 1968 as a heritage railway designed to preserve its majestic history in live action. The railway is operated privately and looked after by many dedicated volunteers who helped to offer a window into the bygone era of the golden age of Britain's railways, when you could catch trains to and from almost anywhere in the country, including small villages like this. The Heritage Railway is a hugely popular tourist attraction that forms the beating heart of the Worth Valley region, with steam trains still chugging along these tracks even today. But what's more is that the Worth Valley line is particularly notable for starring heavily in the iconic British film The Railway Children, which we mentioned earlier, and which was filmed in numerous places around the area, although it's mostly set in Oakworth, the next stop on the line from here. The legacy of the Railway Children is another wonderful attraction of the local area, with the surrounding countryside home to beautiful muddy footpaths that retrace the steps of the Railway Children, and the Heritage Railway offering a link from Haworth to Oakworth by the good old-fashioned way. Haworth Station's beautifully preserved platforms are yet another treasure of this bewitching village, all the way from its captivating Brontë heritage to be found at the top of the hill, to the locomotives that often pass by here, puffing steam as they go. So if you're ever in the mood to explore a beautiful old English village full of fascinating heritage, then Haworth is without a doubt the place for you. Now looking at the delightful Victorian facade of Haworth Railway Station, we've sadly come to the end of our walk around this wonderful village. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're looking forward to taking a stroll along the streets and hills of Haworth for yourself sometime soon.